Hello, welcome to the webinar on Cheiron's public plan tool. My name is Gene Kelwarski, and with me today is my colleague Bill Hallmark, and we'll be taking turns presenting today. Before we walk you through the tool, we'd like to thank Boston College's Center for Retirement Research, the Center for State and Local Government Excellence, and NASRA for creating the public plan database for the underlying data in our public plan tool. The public plan database tracks 190 of the nation's largest public pension plans. And we'd especially like to thank Keith Brainerd and Alex Brown of NASRA for their invaluable feedback in developing the tool and for pilot testing the tool with a small group of NASRA members. You can find the tool on our website, www.cheiron.us, under Resources, and that's hopefully the screen you're looking at. And under Resources, you'll see Databases. And under Databases, it'll take you to three databases, but you can click on the first one, and that is the public plan database. Takes a bit to load. You can also find the tool on the NASRA website under Research Center in Selected Industry Resource and Reports. And finally, we look forward to your feedback on how we can improve the tool, and we welcome any questions, and please send them our way. You should have on the upper right-hand side of your screen a box that has the word question in a blue banner line, and that's where you can put your questions. And if you don't see that box, there's a top red button that expands that folder, and then you'll see the box. Bill and I will answer many of the questions as soon as possible after our presentation, and if we can't answer all of them within a lot of time, we promise we'll email you the answers. So now I'm going to walk you through the tool, and you're looking at a screen that says Cheiron Plans Risk Metrics. And at the bottom, you'll see several tabs. We're on the Introduction tab, and then we'll go into Plan Data, where you select the plan to be compared, and then the various metrics that Bill and I will be walking you through. So at this point, I'm going to click on the Plan Data tab. And you see data for various dashboards and measures for the years 2001 through 2018. At the very top, there's a drop-down menu that allows you to select a plan. So for example, if I hit the drop-down, you see they're alphabetical: Alabama, Alaska, but the very top one is average. And if you have a plan that's name starts saying the W's or Y's, you can just type that letter in and it'll scoot down to that part of the menu. But for today's webinar, we're just going to stick to the average, compare the average of all the 190 plan statistics and compare to the other 190 plans. There's also a lever to the right that if you don't want to just look at the entire period, 2001 through 18, you can scroll and shorten the period. Right now it's shortened to 2006. Go back to the beginning. Finally, if you notice any errors or missing data in your plan's underlying data, because we found some with our own plans, we included this little contact us envelope there at the bottom. You can click on that, and I think that will go to NASRA, Alex at NASRA, and they'll make the data correction to the database. So now I'll begin going through the metrics, and the first one, just the assumptions. And so what we're looking at are the assumptions for the 190 plans. The light blue band represents the 75th and 95th percentile. The light green band at the bottom represents the 5th to the 25th percentile. Then the olive green band represents the 25th to the 50th. And the dark blue represents the 50th to the 75th. And the gold is the selected plan. In this case, is the average plan. You'll notice that in some years, you don't see some of the colors. And so, for example, here in 2017, well, 2018, let me start with, you see all four colors. 2017, we're missing the dark blue. That's because for that year, all the plants in that percentile had the same assumption. So that would appear as a thin line that's naked to the human eye. So it's not an error when you see that. But when you get to the results, focusing on them, you see back in 2001, the average plan's discount rate was 8.02%. And over time, it has declined to 7.27. And you see the top of the light blue, very few plans are in the 8+ region, whereas back here, there were quite a few plans. Then we have the inflation rate in the bottom graph. And what I found interesting was the inflation rate average was 3.83, and it dropped to 2.72. So the inflation assumption for the average plan in the database dropped by more than full 100 basis points, whereas the discount rate dropped by less. And that was interesting. And you'll see on several of the pages, boxes down below that allow you to hover over them, and it defines what the various metric is. So that's just a thing to help you navigate through this tool. Now we'll move to the funding ratio. This is the market value of assets divided by the actuarial liability as measured by the plan. So different plans do have different discount rates, so it's a bit of apples to oranges. But in 2001, the average funded ratio for these plans was at 101%, 101.9. Then with that dot-com recession, it dropped significantly over the next 2 years, down to 83.6%. Then there was the recovery, and then the 2008 and 9 recession, where it dropped way down to 63.2. And today, the average plan in the database, or not today, 2018, is at 78.8%. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, and I hope this handoff works. Bill, if you can unmute your phone.
Thanks, Gene. I'm going to talk about the next couple tabs. We know that mature pension plans are more sensitive to risk. And with the implementation of ASOP 51 on risk disclosures, most actuaries are including some maturity metrics in their reports. But what we found is that the maturity metrics are hard to interpret without some context. And so that was one of the reasons we generated this tool, was to help plans compare to other plans on these maturity metrics and to see how those metrics changed over time. The first maturity metric shown in the top graph here is the support ratio. It's the number of retirees and inactives compared to active employees. The higher the ratio, more inactives each active employee has to support. And over time, you can see for the average plan, that ratio has nearly doubled. There is quite a bit of variation between plans on this metric, and particularly you'll find closed plans tend to have higher and growing ratios here. I would note up at the top, there's this indicator that shows whether the plan you're looking at is closed or not. For the average is showing that it's not, but if we select a closed plan, it will say yes. The next metric down below here is net cash flow. Contributions less benefit payments and expenses as a percent of the total assets of the plan. It's not uncommon to have negative cash flow, especially if you're extremely well funded. It is, in fact, an objective of pre-funding the plan to get to negative cash flow. But when you have negative cash flow, it makes you more sensitive to investment risk, particularly in the near term. And again, you'll see that closed plans can have significant negative cash flow because they're primarily paying out benefits already earned rather than pre-funding new benefits. And it's switched to the next tab, which is the leverage ratios, or some people refer to these as volatility ratios. And these ratios are not as intuitive as the support ratio or the net cash flow, but they are actually more meaningful. The asset leverage ratio, which is shown in the top, is the market value of assets divided by payroll. Plans with higher ratios are more sensitive to investment risk. So as an example, a plan with a ratio of 5, which is fairly close to the average right now, that earns an investment return that's 10% less than its assumption. So if it's assuming 7%, that'd be a minus 3% return. That plan would suffer an investment loss equivalent to 50% of its payroll, the 10% times the 5. But if you had a similar plan with the same investment return and the same investment assumption that had an asset leverage ratio of 10 instead of 5, that same investment loss would be equivalent to 100% of payroll, or twice the impact as the first plan. So this measure really indicates the sensitivity to investment losses and the impact on your plan. And there's a wide range of these ratios, which indicates that different plans have significantly different degrees of sensitivity to investment risk. The bottom ratio is the actuarial liability leverage ratio, and it's just the actuarial liability divided by payroll. It's very similar to the asset leverage ratio that measures the plan's sensitivity to gains and losses, and probably more importantly, to assumption changes. So a plan with a higher liability leverage ratio will have a greater sensitivity to a change in the discount rate or changes in mortality. It'll have a bigger impact on the costs of the plan. It should also be noted that if a plan is 100% funded, both the asset leverage ratio and the actuarial liability leverage ratio will be the same. Now I'm going to turn to the normal cost rates. There's no perfect way to compare benefits offered by different plans, but the total normal cost rate represents the expected costs of the benefits for the current year of service. So it's a decent proxy for comparison. However, like with the funded status, you have to be aware that different assumptions, including different discount rates, affect the normal cost rate. So the direct comparisons are a little bit fraught. The top chart shows the total normal cost rate, and the bottom chart shows the employer normal cost rate, which is just the total normal cost rate less employee contributions. So you can see the expected employer contribution towards those benefits. It's also important to note that in this database, these rates are a blend of the normal cost rates in your plan, covering all the different groups and benefit tiers in the plan. We can also separate this data based on whether the plan is in Social Security or not in Social Security. So if we looked at plans that are not in Social Security, you'll see that they tend to have slightly higher normal cost rates than plans that are in Social Security, where the measures drop down. So if you're doing a comparison, you may want to make sure that you're comparing to like plans. And again, up here, this will indicate whether the database considers the plan to be in Social Security or not. We are aware that some plans have a mix, and we are just reporting it based on what the database indicates whether you're in or not. One of the things I found interesting on this chart is that with all of the new lower benefit tiers we've seen adopted over the last decade, we'd expect the normal cost rate to gradually move down as those benefit tiers become effective. But also, with all the decreases in the discount rate, we'd expect the normal cost rate to go up. And so this shows that for the average plan, you're seeing a fairly even balance and a lot of stability in that rate with some slight increases over time. So now I'm going to turn it back to Jean to talk about tread water rates and ratios. Jean, are you on mute?
Yeah, I was on mute. The definition of tread water rate can be found at the bottom here by hovering over definition. It's the normal cost, which is the cost of benefits being earned, plus interest on the unfunded actuarial liability as a percentage of payroll. This term is, tread water, is gaining popularity. I've seen it mentioned in several surveys and publications. And I'm going to give you an example with a credit card. Suppose you have a credit card debt, a bill comes in for $100 and you're only able to pay $50 the next month. And it has a 10% monthly finance charge. So next month's bill is going to take the $50, and you also had $10 of purchases in the next month. So it takes the prior balance, 50 plus 10 plus the finance charges. Now your new bill is going to be 65. But if you paid the full finance charge of 5 and your purchases of 10, 65 less 15, you're back at 50, and that's why it's called tread water. The credit card is like your unfunded liability. If you're going to pay for the cost of the unfunded, the interest on the unfunded and the cost of benefits earned, your unfunded is going to stay the same. The top graph is the actual tread water cost rate in the database, and the bottom graph, which we'll get into later, is the ratio of the actually paid contributions to the tread water. So let me start with the top chart. So for the average plan back in 2001, tread water was at 12.4%. And today, the average plan, in order to avoid a growing unfunded liability, has to increase. The tread water contribution rate is at 25.4%. And you can see the tread water rising during the recession here and the dot-com drop, because the interest on the unfunded component caused it to rise. But I find the bottom graph more interesting. What are plans paying relative to their tread water? And you want to be above 100%, or else your unfunded is going to grow. Back in 2001, the average plan was just over 100%. And then the plans dropped well below 100% after the dot-com burst. And then it raised over to 107.6% in 2007, and then a significant drop all the way down to 58.75 by 2009. And since then, we've been seeing a gradual increase where we're now at 110.9. So Bill, why don't you finish up the last one, and then we'll take some of the questions we've got.
Thanks. So earlier, Jean showed the distribution of expected returns or discount rate. This chart on the top has another way to look at the expected return assumption, which is in terms of the real rate of return, which is the expected return less the assumed inflation. Real rates of return are particularly important if your liability is sensitive to inflation. Now, the liability for active members is sensitive to inflation because salary increases adjust over time for actual inflation. Retiree liabilities, however, might be completely sensitive to inflation, just partially sensitive, or not sensitive at all, depending on your COLA provisions. So the importance of the real rate of return will vary from plan to plan. I think it is interesting to note that over this time period where we've seen the drop in the discount rate, the real rates of return, and this is similar to what Gene pointed out comparing to the inflation assumption, the real rates of return have increased from about 4.2 to 4.5 or 4.6%, just a slight increase, but they've held relatively stable compared to the drops in the discount rate. The chart on the bottom shows the implied risk premium for the plan's discount rate. The implied risk premium is the amount that the plan's expected return exceeds the yield on the 10-year treasury. In 2001, the average plan had a discount rate of 8%, but the yield on the 10-year treasury was 5.3. So the plan had to take enough investment risk to beat the 10-year treasury yield by 2.7%. That's the implied risk premium. But if you fast forward to 2018, the average plan dropped its discount rate all the way from 8 to 7.25. But the yield on the 10-year treasury has dropped even further to 2.9%. So the average plan now has to take enough risk to beat the 10-year treasury by 4.4% instead of 2.7. This has been one of the real challenges for public pension plans and all pension plans, is that as interest rates have declined, they've had to take on more investment risk in order to achieve their expected return, even as they've dropped the expected return. So with that, Dean, I'll turn it back to you to see if there are any questions
We've got a few here.
Notes.
Can you hear me, Bill? Can you hear?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. The first question is negative cash flow a bad thing? Is there a certain level at which it can cause difficulties for a plan? And as Bill mentioned, if you actually meet your objectives and fully fund the plan, and as the plan matures, you're going to automatically have negative cash flows. You can't call it a bad thing, but it does mean you're more vulnerable to investment volatility. But as far as a certain level which can cause difficulties, we've looked at a number of plans that have high negative cash flow. You'll find a lot more in the what's called the Taft-Hartley industry than the public plan industry. But I've seen that once you get to a ratio of 5 or greater, the sensitivity is very significant. Bill, I'll give you the next question. Can you see it?
The healthy funded ratio?
No. If you're a mature plan with negative cash flow, how can you counteract the impact through your asset allocation to minimize your sensitivity to investment risk?
Yeah, well, that's the question for the investment consultant than the actuary. But the first thing you'll need to look at with the negative cash flow, particularly for a mature plan or a closed plan, is what your liquidity requirements are going forward, and make sure that you have structures in place to generate the cash so that you have it available to pay the benefits. And that can limit what you can do in your investment allocation. And then beyond that, to get to the sensitivity issue, it is just a matter of controlling the volatility in your investment returns with your investment consultant.
The next question, and Bill, we can both tackle this. Is there a healthy funded ratio the plan should strive for? So let me go to the funding ratio tab. And you see where we were over 100%, dropped significantly down, and now we're at 78.6%. I've always answered this question by saying, if I looked at two plans, one that's 100%, and let's say the other one is 70% funded, and I did a projection, and the 70% funded plan is heading towards 100%, and the 100% plan is heading towards 70%. I would say the plan at 70% is a healthier plan. So it's not a function of the snapshot funded ratio, but the direction that the plan is heading. Do you want to add anything to that, Bill?
Yeah, I'd say first, all plans should have a plan to get to 100% funded ratio from wherever you are. But to assess health, there's a lot more that you need to look at. And part of it is assessing whether the sponsors of the plan can afford to pay for the unfunded liability. And you can have a plan that is 50% funded, but the unfunded liability is easily affordable to the sponsor. And you can have another plan that's 80% funded, where that missing 20% really puts a lot of stress on the sponsor. And so some of these maturity metrics, the leverage ratios, and also the treadwater rates can give you a good indication of how much stress that level of funding places on the sponsor in order to fund the plan.
The next question we received is as follows. Is it possible to use the Power BI to compare the plan's performance? And I'm assuming this means investment. If so, can you demo the comparison? Bill, I'm trying to recall if historical investment performance is even in this database. Do you recall?
I don't recall, but that's a good suggestion, and we can look at it. But we are running this off of the public plans database, so we're limited by whatever data is in that database. So if
and any suggestions
are in there, we could build that.
And remember, any suggestions you may have, the bottom right there's that little envelope, and it goes directly to NASRA.
And to us.
And to us, okay. The next question, are plan liabilities normalized for differences in assumptions? The answer is no. On this version of Power BI, we have tinkered with methods to do that on our own in a different environment. But there's some complications, and Bill, you may want to discuss those complications.
Yeah, so different plans, the impact of changing the discount rate will have a different adjustment for different plans. And so some of the early metrics that did that used just a standard adjustment factor. And so that's not really accurate for all of the plans. And so we're trying to balance what we can use out of the database to get us an approximate factor to adjust at least for the discount rate. Adjusting for mortality and other assumptions would just be very difficult. So I don't think we will ever be able to adjust for that.
We have one more comment to make, but before I make that, if you haven't sent any questions so far, now's a good time to go ahead and do so. We probably won't be answering it live in this session, but we will email your answer to you. But we looked at the database while Bill was answering that last question, and one of the things we see in the database that could become a metric, it's showing asset allocation by plan historical, and that could be an interesting thing to look at. So at this point, we want to thank you for participating in the webinar. Once again, you can find the tool on our website under resources and then under databases, and you can also find it under the NASRA website. So with that being said, if you'd like any further information, email us directly at information@cheiron.us, and we look forward to hearing from you, and we hope you found this tool useful. Thank you.